As hi everyone. As Ellie just said, I'm Emily, and I'm going to talk about rare disease patient journeys towards diagnosis. And my email's there if you want to send me any questions after the talk. So a bit about rare diseases. So rare diseases actually don't have a uniform definition, but in Europe, we say a disease is rare if it affects less than 1 in 2,000 people. Whereas in the US, it's said to be rare if it affects less than 200,000 people in the US as a whole, which is about less than 1 in 1,600 people. So clearly this is a challenge in itself in that the lack of uniformity, like globally. But this shows that rare diseases are, of course, individually rare. We can see this, but when there are over 10,000 types of rare diseases, it actually ends up they are collectively common, and to the extent where it affects 1 in 17 people, and that's based on a study in Europe. So 1 in 17 people have been or will be affected by a rare disease in Europe, which is quite shocking when you look at it like that. So it's a really big issue, and it's not just a very small minority it affects. So it's worth considering this. And now I'm going to focus on the patient journey today, because they're specifically the journey towards diagnosis, right? Because while these diseases are so rare, actually, when we consider that they are collectively common, we can look at them as a whole and not just build up very specific rare diseases, but we can actually support rare disease diagnosis as a whole. And there are some common trends within rare diseases. But one challenge that people with rare diseases often face is a diagnostic odyssey, or the diagnostic journey, because it's excessively long. And I just want to describe that a little bit now. So it starts, as you might expect, with the patient will get symptoms and they'll visit their primary care physician. But rather than getting a diagnosis, then they'll likely be referred to a specialist, or they might be misdiagnosed, and that's is quite shocking to think. More than half, so the majority of rare disease patients were misdiagnosed at least once, and with misdiagnoses we get mistreatments, which like including surgeries that are unnecessary, so it can be extremely harmful for patients' health. So it is a really big issue if we're getting these misdiagnoses, and all the while it delays the correct diagnosis. And then what you often get is kind of a tour, like patients go to and fro from their primary care physician to the specialists, which again is challenging, and it's another hurdle, it's another step, and it just slows down this journey towards the diagnosis. And again, it's another point where patients can be misdiagnosed. They could be misdiagnosed by the first specialist they see, but the majority of patients will also be referred to another specialist. So 71% consulted with more than 3 doctors, which is quite shocking when you think about it. That's a lot of consultations for one condition. And that's the vast majority. And again, there's a lack of consistency. It's a new face each time you're a new specialist, and it can be really, really challenging in that respect. But also when you're misdiagnosed and you're treated, you might then be referred back to a specialist, because when it's suspected that maybe that's an incorrect diagnosis. So that's kind of, it can join back on that pathway then. But again, you could be misdiagnosed by this other specialist, and if in fact 37% were misdiagnosed 3 or more times. So it's hugely significant when we think of that, because each time it's not just the delayed diagnosis, and not just the mistreatments, it's also the building distrust in the healthcare system, and it can be really taxing emotionally to deal with misdiagnoses, especially when they're mental health related. And then you get this kind of loop where it's not just we're referred to the final specialist, but it's just passed from one specialist to another, and frequently being referred back to the primary care physician, but yeah, just regularly being referred to more and more doctors. So on average, consulting with 5 doctors. So that's obviously really difficult in itself. There's also so 80% of rare diseases are genetic. So if they're genetic, you might they might go through, rare disease patients might go through genetic testing. And this is again another loop process. So it's genetic test after genetic test until you can get the right one. And hopefully when you get the right one, you get a diagnosis, which is amazing. But if it's not genetic, or if it's identified in other methods, you might reach a diagnosis straight from that specialist. So all of this is a lot of information that I've kind of tried to break down here, but it's just a really long and challenging and stressful journey on this way to diagnosis, with the average patient waiting 4 years to receive a diagnosis, which is significant if you think if your condition's constantly deteriorating. That can have a huge impact, and rare disease patients often describe having to play catch up on these treatments that they're not able to have because they've not had that diagnosis. So hopefully I've kind of given you a little bit of a background on the difficulty of rare disease diagnosis. So it is this really difficult, sort of complicated process. What's interesting about it is that this is a common theme. It's not like the odd patient that goes through these journeys, but it's very common with rare diseases. And with that, we need to kind of, if we're developing technology for rare disease patients, or for rare disease diagnosis, we need to consider this. So in this case, or what stage of the journey do you want a diagnostic decision support system? So if you're going to support the clinician in diagnosis, which clinician? There's so many of them, and at which stage? At the first visit to the GP, or later on? It's difficult to know this, but perhaps decision support, the diagnostic decision support systems for rare diseases need to be a more long-term application, where it's not just for one GP, but actually it kind of follows the patient's journey, and it really integrates better with this experience that patients have. But also we need to consider, well, there's lots of different types of doctors, each with their own specialty. So they might want different things out of a system. So for example, your primary care physician, well, it would be useful just to have an idea of what specialist to refer to. So to have an idea of what type of condition it is. because that could be a huge step. If you could reduce the number of specialist referrals, that would significantly reduce that time. Whereas maybe later on, if you've got a geneticist, right, they might be using the system to directly look at genetic conditions, and specifically what conditions this patient's experiencing. So it's really important in this case that the system's not just designed for one doctor. It's not a one size fits all, but it actually works all through this journey and all through this process. But also, how do you measure success in this? If we've got a system that only works once, like one time, it's only working at one point each time you use it, then you assess it there and then. But here, if it's working multiple times, it might reduce the time to diagnosis by a number of years, but it still might, might appear to perform poorly at the initial visit. So it's really important to consider when we're designing technology within this example, to consider that context. So that's one of the areas that's one of the ways in which we should do this. So thank you for listening. Here are my references.